The email notification arrived at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in late September, and Marcus Aldridge, 52, a retired civil engineer and coastal surveyor, felt his blood pressure spike before he'd even opened the attachment. Subject line: Final notice. Compliance required. Marcus sat at his kitchen table overlooking Crescent Bay, watching the sunrise paint the water gold, and clicked the PDF. The Harbor Ridge Homeowners Association, an organization that shouldn't have existed, on land they had no legal right to develop, was demanding he remove his unauthorized dock structure within 30 days or face legal action. His dock, the one his grandfather had built in 1947. On the peninsula Marcus's family had owned since 1889. The same peninsula where 104 luxury homes now stood, their residents blissfully unaware that every foundation, every septic system, every manicured lawn sat on property that belonged to Marcus Aldridge. But today, that was about to change. Marcus had spent 18 months gathering documentation, consulting with maritime lawyers and waiting for the perfect storm. And as he looked at the weather forecast showing the season's highest tide predictions for the coming weekend, he smiled. The floodgates, both literal and legal, were about to open. Before we dive into how Marcus reclaimed an entire peninsula and dismantled a multi-million-dollar development built on stolen land, if you love stories where entitled people finally face the consequences of their greed and one man's patience delivers perfect justice, hit that like button and subscribe. Now let's see exactly how a retired engineer used 100-year-old property deeds and the forces of nature to take back what was rightfully his. This is a story in 3 parts. The violation that transformed family legacy into a developer's profit machine. The confrontation where a century of legal documentation met modern arrogance, and the resolution where water, law, and time conspired to deliver justice that no courtroom could have orchestrated more perfectly. In the first outline, you'll discover how Marcus endured watching his ancestral peninsula transform from protected wetland into exclusive development. How a powerful regional development corporation exploited legal loopholes and municipal corruption. How Marcus's attempts to stop construction were crushed by lawyers and money, and the moment he realized that fighting them conventionally was exactly what they expected. In the second outline, the confrontation unfolds as Marcus presents irrefutable evidence that every home, every road, every utility connection violates property rights dating back to the 19th century, as the HOA board discovers their title insurance is worthless, as panicked homeowners realize they've purchased houses built on land they don't own, and as Marcus offers terms that will change everything. In the third outline, justice arrives on schedule with astronomical high tides, as Marcus exercises water rights that predate the development by 135 years, as modern infrastructure meets historical easements, and as entitled residents who demanded his compliance face consequences they never imagined possible. Here's exactly how it happened. Marcus Aldridge had never intended to become a thorn in anyone's side. At 52, he'd spent 3 decades as a civil engineer specializing in coastal development and tidal dynamics, retiring early after selling his consulting firm to spend more time on the family property. The Aldridge Peninsula, though no map had called it that for generations, jutted into Crescent Bay like a crooked finger. 47 acres of salt marsh, maritime forest, and elevated ground that had belonged to his family since his great-great-grandfather purchased it from the original land grant holder in 1889. Marcus had grown up spending summers there, learning to sail in the protected waters, fishing off the dock his grandfather built, understanding the rhythm of tides and seasons. When his father passed in 2019, Marcus inherited the property with a simple instruction in the will: protect it. This land has memory. Marcus had intended to do exactly that, living quietly in the original family house, a weathered but sturdy structure on the highest point of the peninsula. But in March 2022, everything changed. The first violation came as a surveying crew. When Marcus returned from a weekend visiting his daughter in Charlotte to find orange stakes throughout the southern portion of his property. Men in hard hats were setting up equipment near the wetlands, and when Marcus approached, clipboard in hand with his property deed, the crew chief barely glanced at him. "Wetland mitigation project," the man said dismissively. "County approved. You need to clear the area." Marcus produced his deed, pointed to the boundary markers his family had maintained for generations, and explained that they were on private property. The crew chief smirked and pulled out a development permit from Cascade Regional Development Corporation, showing approval for 104 residential units on Crescent Bay Peninsula Tract 7. Marcus's stomach dropped. Someone had gotten permits to develop his land. He called the county planning office immediately, was transferred 4 times, and finally reached a planner who explained that Cascade had filed development applications using a corrected survey that resolved historical boundary errors. When Marcus demanded to see this corrected survey, he was told he'd need to file a formal records request. By the time that request was processed 3 weeks later, construction crews had cleared 15 acres of maritime forest. The second violation escalated rapidly over the following months. Marcus watched in disbelief as massive earth-moving equipment reshaped his peninsula. The wetlands his grandfather had protected were filled and graded. The maritime forest that had stood for centuries was reduced to stumps. When Marcus attempted to physically block construction vehicles in June 2022, county sheriffs arrived and threatened him with arrest for interfering with permitted construction. He hired a property attorney who filed an emergency injunction, but Cascade's legal team, 3 lawyers from a regional firm with deep political connections, produced documentation claiming the property had been acquired through tax sale in 1987, during a period when Marcus's father had been seriously ill and missed payments. The judge, noting the decades-old tax sale and Cascade's permits, denied the injunction pending full hearing. That hearing was scheduled for March 2023, 10 months away. By then, 40 homes had foundations poured. Marcus felt the weight of helplessness that comes when money and power simply plow through justice. His property attorney admitted that even with a valid claim, fighting Cascade would cost hundreds of thousands in legal fees with no guarantee of success. "They do this," the attorney said quietly. "They target properties with elderly owners, complex histories, or title complications. By the time anyone can fight back legally, the development is fait accompli, and judges are reluctant to order demolition." The third incident became Marcus's breaking point in November 2022. Cascade had completed the infrastructure, roads, utilities, drainage systems, and begun selling homes. The development, now branded Harbor Ridge at Crescent Bay, marketed luxury coastal living starting at $850,000. Marcus received a cease and desist letter from the newly formed Harbor Ridge Homeowners Association demanding he remove his dock, citing it as an unpermitted structure that violated HOA covenants. His dock, built in 1947, on his property. The letter threatened legal action and daily fines. When Marcus appeared at the HOA's first board meeting to explain that he owned the land their entire development sat on, he was dismissed as a crank. Board President Victoria Ashford, 44, a pharmaceutical sales executive who'd purchased Lot 23, literally laughed. "Sir, I have title insurance and a clean deed. Whatever property dispute you think you have is clearly resolved. Now, about that dock, it's an eyesore and it violates our architectural standards." Marcus tried to present his documentation, but the board refused to look at it. Security will escort you out if necessary, Victoria said coldly. Marcus left humiliated, listening to the new residents mock him in the parking lot. That's the crazy old... Marcus tried the conventional routes one final time. He filed complaints with the county, contacted the state attorney general's office, and even reached out to local media. Every path hit walls. The county planning director, Marcus discovered, had received campaign contributions from Cascade's CEO. The attorney general's office said it was a civil property matter. The local newspaper ran a brief story that Cascade's lawyers immediately threatened to sue over, resulting in a retraction. Marcus realized that fighting through official channels meant years of litigation against opponents with unlimited resources. But Marcus Aldridge hadn't spent 30 years as a coastal engineer without understanding that some forces couldn't be bought, intimidated, or litigated against. He stopped trying to fight Cascade directly and instead spent the next 18 months doing what he did best: research, documentation, and engineering analysis. He pulled every property record from 1889 forward, documenting an unbroken chain of title that no tax sale could have legally severed because the taxes in question had actually been paid. His father's bank records proved it. He obtained the original land grant surveys, which showed his property boundaries precisely matching his current deed. He researched Cascade's history and found a pattern: 6 previous developments built on disputed land, all settled quietly after construction because demolition was impractical. But most importantly, he researched something else entirely, something Cascade's engineers had either ignored or never understood: water rights, tidal easements, storm surge patterns, and the historical flood control systems his grandfather had built in the 1940s. If they wanted to play games with his property, Marcus would show them what games really looked like. And on September 15, 2024, when that HOA email arrived demanding dock removal, everything was finally ready. Marcus's response to the HOA's demand arrived not by email, but by certified mail to every single homeowner in Harbor Ridge, to Cascade Regional Development Corporation, to the county planning office, and to the state attorney general. The package was substantial: 147 pages of documentation, including certified copies of property deeds dating to 1889, the original land grant survey, his grandfather's 1947 property survey showing the entire peninsula, his father's tax payment records proving the 1987 tax sale was fraudulent, and a legal opinion from a maritime property attorney explaining that every structure in Harbor Ridge constituted trespass on private property. But the cover letter, written in Marcus's precise engineering style, made everything clear. To the residents and administrators of the development currently occupying the Aldridge Peninsula, you are living on my property. Every home, road, and utility connection represents ongoing trespass and property theft. This letter serves as formal notice that legal action will commence within 30 days unless the following resolution is achieved. Marcus delivered these packages on a Friday afternoon, then spent the weekend watching his security cameras as Harbor Ridge descended into chaos. The first call came Saturday morning at 7:23 a.m. from a panicked homeowner named David Chen, Lot 67, a software executive who'd paid $20,000 for his waterfront property. "Mr. Aldridge, I received your package. This has to be some kind of mistake. I have title insurance. My deed is clean. Cascade wouldn't have sold us properties with title problems." Marcus's response was calm, almost gentle. "Mr. Chen, I'm sure your title insurance company is very interested in this documentation too. I've sent copies to them. You might want to review your policy exclusions regarding fraudulent underlying transactions." The silence on the other end was profound. By noon Saturday, Marcus had received 47 calls. By Sunday evening, Harbor Ridge's community Facebook group had devolved into panic as residents realized that title insurance might not cover homes, built on property that was stolen in the first place. The confrontation Marcus had been waiting for arrived Monday morning when Victoria Ashford appeared at his door, flanked by 2 other board members and a lawyer Marcus recognized from Cascade's legal team. Marcus invited them onto his porch, the porch of the house built in 1923, the house that predated their entire development by a century, and offered coffee. "We've reviewed your documentation," the lawyer began, attempting authority. "And while there are some interesting historical claims, the reality is that Cascade has clear title acquired through proper legal channels, and any dispute you have is decades old and likely barred by statute of limitations." Marcus smiled and pulled out a folder. "Let me share what I've learned about Cascade's proper legal channels," he said. "The 1987 tax sale you're relying on? These are my father's bank records showing the taxes were paid on time. The county incorrectly applied the payment to a different parcel. Here's the county treasurer's letter from 1988 acknowledging the error and refunding the overpayment. That makes your tax sale void. It never legally transferred property." Victoria's face went pale, but she pressed on. "Even if that's true, we've been here for 2 years. Adverse possession." Marcus cut her off. "Adverse possession requires 20 years in this state, and it requires the occupation to be unchallenged. I've been challenging it since day one. I have documented complaints, filed injunctions, and maintained visible presence on my property. No adverse possession claim can succeed." He pulled out another document. "But let's talk about the present situation. You demanded I remove my dock. Let me explain what that dock actually is." Marcus spread out his grandfather's 1947 engineering drawings. "This dock is actually a tidal control gate structure. My grandfather built it as part of a comprehensive flood control system because this peninsula naturally floods during astronomical high tides. See these channels throughout your development? You probably think those are decorative water features. They're actually the original tidal channels that my grandfather incorporated into a managed flood system. The dock controls water flow to prevent flooding." The Cascade lawyer shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Aldridge, even if your property claims have merit, the reality is that 104 families have purchased homes in good faith. No court will order demolition of an entire development. The practical remedy would be compensation for the land value." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "You're probably right that no court will order demolition. But here's what you don't understand. I don't want your money. I want my property back, and I don't need a court to make that happen." He pulled out a weather report and a tide chart. "This weekend, we're getting the highest astronomical tide of the year, combining with a weather system that will produce significant storm surge. The tide will reach 8.7 feet above mean high water. Your development has an average elevation of 7.2 feet. Without my grandfather's flood control system operating, Harbor Ridge will be underwater." Victoria found her voice. "You're threatening to flood our homes?" Marcus shook his head. "I'm not threatening anything. I'm explaining reality. That flood control system requires active management. The gates need to be adjusted based on tidal predictions and weather conditions. It's something my grandfather did, my father did, and I've been doing for the past 40 years. But you've demanded I remove my dock, which means removing the control gates. Without those gates, the natural tidal flow will resume. And the natural tidal flow floods the peninsula during high astronomical tides." Marcus laid out photographs from historical floods in 1963, 1979, and 1998. Times when his grandfather and father had failed to properly adjust the gates and the peninsula had flooded, water reaching 3 to 4 feet deep in the lower areas. He showed them the engineering study he'd completed in 2023, documenting how Cascade's development had eliminated natural drainage, paved over absorbent ground, and created a situation where flooding would be far worse than in the historical events. "Your homes aren't just built on my property," Marcus explained quietly. "They're built in a managed flood zone that only functions because of infrastructure my family built and maintains. Remove that infrastructure or simply stop maintaining it and nature takes over. The lawyer tried to regain control. This sounds like a threat of intentional property damage, Mr. Aldridge. That's criminal. Marcus smiled. No, counselor. This is me explaining that you've built homes in a location that requires active flood management, and you're demanding I remove the flood management system. I'm simply complying with your demands. If the natural consequences of that compliance include flooding, that's not my responsibility. You built in a flood zone without permission, without easements, and without understanding the infrastructure that made construction possible in the first place. Victoria's voice shook. What do you want? Marcus pulled out a document he'd had prepared by his maritime attorney. I want acknowledgement that this is my property. I want every homeowner to sign an easement agreement recognizing my ownership and granting them a 99-year lease for $1 per year per home. I want the HOA dissolved and replaced with a property owners association that I control. I want complete authority over all external modifications, development, and land use. I want Cascade Regional Development to sign over all infrastructure they've built as compensation for trespass. And I want all of this completed within 72 hours before this weekend's high tide. The lawyer stood. This is extortion. Marcus stood as well. No, this is property rights. You have 72 hours to decide. After that, I'm removing the flood control gates for maintenance as required by maritime safety regulations, and they'll remain out of service during the weekend's high tide. What happens after that is between you, your insurance companies, and the laws of physics. I'll be here, on my property, in my house that sits at 14 feet elevation, watching the tide come in. Victoria stared at him in disbelief. You'd really flood 104 homes just to make a point? Marcus met her eyes. Ms. Ashford, you laughed at me when I tried to explain this was my property. You called security to remove me. Your development destroyed a century of family legacy, clear-cut protected forest, and filled wetlands that took thousands of years to form. You built an entire community on stolen land and thought money and lawyers would make it disappear. So yes, I'll absolutely let nature demonstrate what happens when you build where you don't belong. Maybe watching your homes flood will teach you something about respecting property rights. He walked them to the door. 72 hours. I suggest you start making calls. The next 72 hours became a masterclass in panic and calculation. Marcus watched through his security cameras as an endless parade of vehicles arrived at Harbor Ridge. Homeowners rushing back from work, insurance adjusters, lawyers, engineers from Cascade, even a state legislator who owned Lot 89. His phone rang constantly. But Marcus let every call go to voicemail, listening to messages that progressed from threats to pleas. Tuesday afternoon, Cascade's CEO, Richard Pemberton, arrived personally with an entourage of attorneys, offering to purchase Marcus's entire property for $15 million. Marcus refused the meeting. Tuesday evening, the state attorney general's office called, finally interested now that wealthy homeowners were involved, requesting Marcus delay any action while they investigated. Marcus's response, delivered through his attorney, was simple. Mr. Aldridge will be conducting routine maintenance on his flood control infrastructure this weekend. Any investigation of historical property issues should have been conducted before 104 homes were built on his land. Wednesday morning brought the breakthrough. Victoria Ashford returned, this time without lawyers, and knocked on Marcus's door at 6:30 a.m. She looked like she hadn't slept. Mr. Aldridge, I spoke with my title insurance company. They've confirmed that if your documentation is accurate, they won't cover losses related to property built on land with defective title. My house, my equity, everything I have is in that home. I have 3 children. I'm not asking you to give up your property. I'm asking what you really want because I don't believe you actually want to destroy 104 homes. Marcus invited her in and poured coffee. You're right, he said quietly. I don't want to destroy homes. I wanted to prevent them from being built in the first place. But since I failed at that, I want acknowledgement. I want this development to exist on my terms, respecting this land, managed properly with everyone understanding they're here because I allow it." Victoria nodded slowly. "The 99-year lease for $1 per year, that's essentially free. You're not trying to profit from this." Marcus shook his head. "My family has owned this land for 135 years. We never needed profit from it. We needed to protect it. Your development destroyed that possibility, but at least I can ensure what remains is managed responsibly." Victoria pulled out her phone. "Give me until tonight. I'll get every homeowner to sign. But Marcus," she used his first name for the first time, "you have to promise the flood control system will operate this weekend." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. "Get me signed acknowledgments from every homeowner by 6 p.m. Thursday. Get Cascade to sign over the infrastructure and acknowledge the fraudulent title. And I'll not only operate the flood control system this weekend, I'll upgrade it to handle the increased runoff your development created. Deal?" Victoria exhaled with relief. "Deal." Thursday became a frenzy of document signing as Victoria and a core group of terrified homeowners went door to door with Marcus's easement agreements. By 5:47 p.m., Marcus had 104 signed agreements, each acknowledging his property ownership and accepting the 99-year lease terms. Cascade Regional Development's signature came at 5:52 p.m., delivered by a process server who handed Marcus a signed document, transferring all infrastructure and acknowledging that their development permits had been based on defective title. The document included a confidential settlement clause where Cascade paid Marcus $3.2 million for historical trespass. Money Marcus immediately pledged to wetland restoration on the undeveloped portions of his property. At 6 p.m. exactly, Marcus sent confirmation to every homeowner that the flood control system would operate normally through the weekend's high tide. But Marcus added one additional element that Friday afternoon, something he'd planned but hadn't mentioned. He invited every Harbor Ridge resident to meet at the community pavilion at 4 p.m. to observe the flood control system in operation. 97 people showed up, including families with children, elderly couples, and Victoria with her 3 kids. Marcus led them on a walking tour, explaining his grandfather's engineering, showing them the tidal channels they'd assumed were decorative, demonstrating the gate systems that controlled water flow, and teaching them how the peninsula's natural geography made it both beautiful and vulnerable. "This land has memory," Marcus told them, repeating his father's words. "It remembers the tides, the storms, the seasons. My grandfather learned to work with that memory, not against it. You're living here now, and that's not going to change. But I need you to understand that this isn't just a development where you pay HOA fees and ignore the land around you. You're living in a managed coastal ecosystem, and that management requires respect and understanding." He showed them the weather forecast and tide predictions. Tonight's high tide will reach 8.1 feet above mean high water. Watch what happens. At 8:47 p.m., as the tide reached its peak, Marcus operated the flood control gates, and the Harbor Ridge residents watched in awe as water rose to within inches of their foundations but never breached. Children pointed excitedly at fish swimming through the tidal channels. Adults stood quietly, understanding for the first time how close they'd come to disaster. Marcus explained each adjustment he made, why certain gates needed to be partially closed while others remained open, how water flow had to be balanced to prevent flooding while maintaining tidal exchange. When the tide began to recede at 10:15 p.m., Victoria approached him. "Thank you," she said simply. "And I'm sorry. We should have listened." Marcus nodded. "You should have, but you're listening now. The complications arrived the following week when 3 homeowners, including the Cascade CEO's brother-in-law, attempted to challenge the easement agreements. They'd signed, claiming duress. Marcus's response was swift and devastating. He filed suit not just against those 3 homeowners, but against Cascade Regional Development Corporation, documenting their pattern of development on disputed land across 6 previous projects. The state attorney general, finally taking notice after Marcus's attorney provided comprehensive documentation, opened a criminal investigation into Cascade's business practices. 2 county planning officials resigned when records showed campaign contributions from Cascade coinciding with approved permits. The 3 challenging homeowners quickly withdrew their objections when Marcus's attorney pointed out that their homes could be subject to demolition if they wanted to challenge the settlement agreement. By October's end, the legal challenges had collapsed, but Marcus added an unexpected twist. He approached David Chen, the software executive from Lot 67, who'd been among the first to call, and offered him a position as paid administrator of the new Aldridge Peninsula Property Owners Association. "You've got relevant skills, you understand what's at stake now, and you were one of the few who approached this reasonably," Marcus explained. David accepted, and together they drafted new community guidelines that emphasized environmental stewardship, tidal system education, and respect for the peninsula's ecological significance. 1 month after the confrontation, on a bright November morning with perfect tidal conditions, Marcus stood on his grandfather's dock, the structure that had started everything, and watched children from Harbor Ridge participating in a marsh grass restoration project he'd organized. Victoria's youngest daughter, Maya, carefully planted Spartina grass in the wetland buffer zone while her mother watched, having volunteered to coordinate the restoration effort. The Harbor Ridge residents, initially viewing Marcus as a threat, had gradually come to understand him as the guardian of something precious they'd unknowingly invaded. The development still stood, but it now existed with purpose and context. Property values had actually increased once the story became public. Harbor Ridge had transformed from generic coastal development into a unique community, managed by a nationally recognized coastal engineer who'd literally saved it from flooding. Real estate listings now emphasized the historically preserved title management system as a feature. New residents received mandatory orientation about the peninsula's ecosystem and their role as stewards, rather than just owners. Marcus's resolution came not in a single moment, but in gradual peace. He'd lost the untouched peninsula his father had asked him to protect, but he'd prevented its complete destruction. The maritime forest was gone, but the wetlands were recovering. The 104 homes remained, but their residents now understood they lived in a place that required humility and respect. He kept the $3.2 million from Cascade in a conservation trust, using it to purchase development rights on adjacent properties, ensuring the sprawl would go no further. 2 months after the confrontation, Marcus received a call from a maritime property rights organization asking him to speak at a national conference about protecting coastal land from development pressure. He accepted, using his story to teach others how to document property rights, understand water law, and recognize that sometimes the best defense against development isn't fighting corporations directly, but understanding the land better than they do. Standing at the podium, he shared his grandfather's engineering drawings, his father's determination to protect family legacy, and his own realization that justice sometimes flows like the tide. Slow, patient, and unstoppable when it finally arrives. The lasting impact revealed itself in unexpected ways. 3 other families across the state contacted Marcus after reading news coverage of his case, explaining they faced similar situations where developers had built on disputed land. Marcus helped 2 successfully reclaim property rights using his documentation methods. The 3rd case resulted in a substantial settlement and new state legislation requiring enhanced title verification for coastal developments. Harbor Ridge itself became something Marcus never anticipated, a functioning community that existed in partnership with, rather than opposition to, the natural environment. Residents who'd initially viewed environmental regulations as inconvenient now advocated for stronger coastal protections. The community established an annual Tide Festival celebrating the peninsula's ecosystem, with Marcus giving tours explaining how the flood control system worked and why understanding tidal dynamics mattered. As Marcus sat on his porch on a peaceful December evening, watching the tide come in under careful management, the water reaching precisely the levels his grandfather had designed for, he reflected on what justice actually meant. It hadn't come from courtrooms or judges. It hadn't come from government officials or police. It had come from patience, documentation, understanding the land more deeply than those who sought to exploit it, and recognizing that some forces, tide, time, and truth, couldn't be bought or intimidated. Victoria stopped by that evening, bringing homemade cookies and a card signed by all 104 families, thanking him for the Thanksgiving weekend when the flood control system had protected their homes during an unexpected storm surge. "We were talking at the last property owners meeting," she said, "about putting up a plaque at the pavilion explaining the history of the peninsula and your family's role in protecting it. Would that be okay?" Marcus smiled, thinking of his father's instructions to protect the land, of his grandfather's engineering genius, of the generations who'd understood that true ownership meant stewardship. "That would be very okay," he said. And as Victoria walked back toward her home, toward the community that now existed under his terms, with respect and understanding, Marcus experienced something he hadn't felt in years: peace. Because justice, whether delivered by courtrooms or tides, was equally satisfying when it finally arrived. Across the country in Asheville, North Carolina, a retired environmental lawyer named Patricia Brennan, 58, received a registered letter from the Magnolia Springs Development Corporation informing her that the pristine mountain watershed she'd protected for 40 years was being rezoned for a luxury resort. Patricia smiled, the same smile that had once convinced corporate polluters to settle, rather, then face her in court, and pulled out the original conservation easement she'd personally negotiated with the state in 1985, the one that superseded any local zoning and specifically prohibited commercial development in perpetuity. "Please," she said quietly to the letter, "keep making plans. I'd love to see the look on your face when you discover that some protections can't be rezoned away." The Development Corporation's lawyer went pale when the process server delivered Patricia's response. "But that's a story for